Welcome to the Thunder and Lightning Show. Today we're going to talk about whether the Novus Ordo is a separate rite from the Latin Mass. We're going to start off by talking about what is a rite. So Ryan, would you like to answer that question?
Okay, the best explanation that I can give is it's a series of rituals, or typically it has to do with the celebration of the Mass, but it can also include the breviary, which is now known in the Novus Ordo calls it the Liturgy of the Hours, which is a series of prayers that priests and religious say. But also it would encompass the Mass and the other sacraments as well, but typically it's the Mass. Now in the Catholic Church, is made up of, I think, maybe like 14 or something, 16 different rites. Okay, but then also some of those rites are used in their own different churches, which are part of the one big Catholic Church. So the first rite that everybody knows about is the Roman Rite, which is the principal rite of the Roman Church. But also in the Roman Church, there's other rites, which most people are not familiar with. So in the Archdiocese of Milan in Italy, they have the so-called Ambrosian Rite of Mass, which is different than the Roman Rite of Mass. Another example is in the Archdiocese of Toledo in Spain. They have the Mozarabic Rite there, which is an older form of the Mass, which has a lot of Arab influences from when they were lived under subjugation of Muslims. And then there's minor variations, and like the Diocese of Paris has their own rite, but it's not used much anymore. Then you have the rites of the religious orders in the Roman Church, and those would be the Carthusian Rite, the Dominican Rite, the Carmelite Rite. Those are three that come to the top of my head. There's probably other big ones that I'm just not thinking of right now. And so these are all variations on the Roman Rite. If you go on YouTube, you'll be able to find a Carmelite Mass celebrated by, there was a newly ordained priest in Harrisburg who was ordained last summer. And Cardinal Burke actually did the ordination in the cathedral in Harrisburg. So the next day, this priest, who's a Carmelite hermit, he celebrated Mass in his first Mass in the ancient Carmelite Rite, which is what they use in his order. So it's only slightly different from the Roman Rite. But formerly in history, you had the Sarum Rite, which was used in England, certain, if not all, dioceses in England, and again, it was somewhat different than the Roman. So that's the Roman Church. So in the Roman Church, we have several different rites which are still used. And as I said, that not only includes the Mass, but it includes the Divine Office. Now we go to the Eastern churches, and if you take the Byzantine Catholic Church in America, which in Europe is called the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the Ruthenian Catholic Church in Europe, they have the rite of St. John Chrysostom, which everybody is, I think, not everybody's familiar with, but a lot of people are familiar with the rite of St. John Chrysostom, the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And that's used by pretty much all the Eastern Orthodox. Then you have some of the Oriental churches use an Oriental rite of Mass, like the Syriac rite. I'm somewhat familiar with the Malankara Catholic Church because I have a friend, and she is Malankara, and her brother's a priest, so I went to their liturgy one time. And it's quite different than the Roman Rite. I mean, the skeleton is the same, okay? There's some prayers at the beginning, there's some readings, there's a sermon, offertory, sacrifice, Holy Communion, dismissal. The skeleton is the same, but a lot of the stuff in between is quite different. So that's kind of a quick summary, inexact, of what a rite is.
Yeah, and so that leads us to the question, what is the Novus Ordo its own separate rite from the Latin Mass and vice versa? Now the SSPX have said that the Novus Ordo is its own rite. Formally, it is not, in terms of the Vatican, because was it Pope Benedict XVI who coined the terms extraordinary and ordinary form?
Correct.
So, and that's what it's referred to by a lot of people in the Novus Ordo, in the Roman Rite. So I guess the question is, I don't even know what the question is. Like, where do we go?
Well, the question is this really the case? Is it really the same rite?
Yeah.
And let me ask you this question. Go and watch, for instance, the Carmelite Rite of Mass. You can find it on YouTube. Watch that Mass and compare it to the Old Mass, the Latin Mass, and you will find some very small nuances there in difference. Like the offertory in the Carmelite Rite happens at the beginning of Mass, so the priest pours the wine in the chalice, gets everything set up, and then he goes back down, and then they start things. Some gestures are different too. Now, so you have that. Also, the Dominican Rite, you'll more easily find that on YouTube. And compare those rites of Mass to the old, and you'll say, well, these are, they're different, but it's only slight. If you're a noob and a not uninitiated liturgical expert, you might show up and you would say, oh, these are pretty much the same. I have no idea what's the difference here. Now, those are separate rites, yet they look quite similar. Now, if you compare the Novus Ordo, which is supposedly the same rite of Mass as the Old Mass, if you send a noob into those and compare them, they're going to say these are like two different religions. The skeleton is the same, but pretty much everything else is completely different. And so by that, just the eye test, there is no way if you look at the facts, if you look at the facts of what is a difference in rite versus what things actually look like, there's no way that the Novus Ordo is the same rite as the Old Mass. So that's just the eye test, and that's in a comparison with other rites of the Catholic Church. Then you go to the question of, well, what makes a rite to be a rite? And I'm not an expert in this, but I have watched a couple of YouTubes, so I can give an opinion. And that is, if you watch the Father Ripperger's, he has a tremendous series on tradition and on the liturgy. And he mentions that it's his opinion, and I believe that's a well-founded opinion based on theologians and some experts from the Middle Ages, that the rite can be summarized in the overall skeleton and along with the offertory prayers, and the canon of the Mass. So in the Novus Ordo, you have a brand new offertory, which did not exist in the Roman Rite before. It was something that was invented. And then also the canon of the Mass, the so-called Eucharistic prayer. In the new Mass, you have a new canon. Actually, you have 4 canons, one of which is quite similar to the original Roman canon, only some certain things were changed. The consecration was changed, which is probably significant. And then you have the new Eucharistic prayers that were introduced with the new Mass, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a couple other ones. So Father Ripperger's opinion is, now the fact that you have all these changes in the canon of the Mass, the Eucharistic prayers, combined with the offertory, means that now this is no longer the same rite of Mass by any definition that anyone has ever given before the invention of the Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo would be a different rite of Mass. And, doesn't it seem like that's also the case based on the desire or the will or the words of Pope Paul VI? I mean, he called it the Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of Mass. He didn't exactly say this is a new rite, but, the fact that the Old Mass was in some way allegedly forbidden or whatever, doesn't that indicate to you that the writers of the new Mass, the people who implemented it, thought that the Old Mass was an old rite, which was now forbidden, and here we have this new rite? If it was just 2 forms, they could not have ever said, oh, that's totally forbidden. Now, again, that we already discussed that they were wrong and everything, but this is just the steps and the progression of thinking about this to make the argument that the new rite of Mass, the new Mass, is a new rite, which is different than the old rite, the Latin Mass.
And one thing I wanted to point out was that priests, they can say multiple rites of the Mass.
Correct.
With permission of the bishop. So like a Byzantine priest can say the Novus Ordo if he received permission from the bishop. So the fact that
bishops, I think he would need his own bishop's permission. Then he would need the permission of the Novus Ordo diocese. He'd need his permission too.
So they would need both.
Yeah, you need
bishops.
both. Yeah,
and I guess the fact that there are diocesan priests that say both the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass, that wouldn't I mean, I guess
And
I
another
wouldn't
question is,
really-
do they need a bishop's permission to do that? I mean, a lot of bishops say yes. Now, if a bishop makes you to seek permission for that, then he implicitly admits that the new rite of Mass is a different rite than the old Mass, because he wants to know what I need to know. Why? So I can give permission? Or does he write it down on a little piece of paper? Does he put it in a book? And then when it's time for like the purge or something, that priest is going to get a visit by the diocesan secret police. I don't know.
Well, and I mean, saying the Latin Mass at 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, that's not really intruding too much under the priest's responsibilities under the diocesan
He
bishop.
has a lot of important things to do. I'll have you know, John, that there's very important golf matches that are on TV on Sunday afternoon. And in football season, there's the Steelers are on, and you have to watch them. And then after they're over, the Ravens are on. You have to see them. And then, of course, the Sunday night game. I mean, don't take your religion too seriously. You have to have time for recreation. Like, okay, 3 football games, 3 hours apiece is 9 hours on Sunday. That's not a lot. Okay?
Don't be too rigid.
Don't be too rigid. He's got things to do. He has to recreate, and to ask him if he wants to say another Mass, oh man, there must be something wrong. He's too rigid.
Well, that leads us into the question, what would a formalized Latin Mass rite actually look like? How would it work, I guess, is the question.
Mm-hmm.
And there would, I mean, I guess you could implement it and start it up, so like integrate the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King, but would you bring in some Novus Ordo priests who are interested in exclusively saying the Latin Mass?
Yeah. You asked me this question, I thought about it for a while, and I think make the distinction here between a church or some canonical structure like a religious order versus the rite of the sacraments. And so I think what a lot of... So let's talk about this. Let's say it's a different rite. Well, what does that mean? Well, it just means it has its own set of liturgical books with its own calendar, its own breviary, and its own set of, like, people, you would say, because canon law talks about people who belong to a certain rite. If you're baptized in the Byzantine Church, you're a member of the Byzantine Church, and the Byzantine rite of Mass, the rite of St. John Chrysostom, is yours. And canon law says you have a right, R-I-G-H-T, to your rite, R-I-T-E, and that's in canon law. So if you were to make the Old Mass to be its own rite, then you would canonize in some way the calendar, the missal, the books, and you would also have a group of people who would some way transfer into this rite. And with them being in this rite, they would have a rite, R-I-G-H-T, to hear that Mass. You would have faithful priests who would say that rite and use that rite, which we basically already have with the Fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, Institute of the Good Shepherd, these various other smaller orders. SSPX is in there as well. That on paper, that kind of already exists. But to make it explicit would give it more rights and privileges. Now, make a distinction between that separate rite versus a whole separate church. And so our Byzantine brothers and sisters, they have their own bishops, they have their own dioceses, which are called eparchies. In America, they're eparchies. And they have their own set of canon law. And so more or less, they're just a parallel church with the Roman Church. And some people, there was the talks began with the SSPX, there was the talks of giving them a quasi-status of their own church, of a canonical structure that would be like almost like a worldwide diocese where they would have n number of bishops. They would have this jurisdiction over all of their people throughout the world. They could set up chapels wherever they wanted, ordain priests. And in that sense, they would almost be like a separate church within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Well, and they're big enough that they could, if they were to integrate these other Latin Mass orders in, like I'm talking about the SSPX,
Mm-hmm.
then that would start like a competitive, start a church that would compete with the Novus Ordo,
Yeah, so
which is
yeah,
why I would
yeah.
say it's never going to happen. Well, and if it does happen, you can come back to this video and comment and let me know I was wrong.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. The problem you would have is there's some rivalry between these two groups. The Pope could do it. He would wield his power and say, "I'm going to turn Yins into a separate rite, and I'm going to put a prelate who's in charge of you, and then you'll have these other bishops who will have some authority over your priests, and then under that, then you would have your religious orders, your Fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, SSPX, and they'd be free to fight and compete against each other, because as we all know, competition brings out the best in people. This is why if you watch somebody like, I don't know, boxers sparring or whatever, you're not going to see too many great things. But if you put two guys fighting each other at a football game where there's a trophy or a title on the line, then it brings out the best. So maybe that's the best thing for the church, is to have a competition. How many souls can we save? How many baptisms can we do?
Well, yeah, that's one of the things why I think the bishops will not do that, is because of the competition. Because if you look at the statistics, well,
we don't
if you
want
look at the
competition. We just want participation trophies. It's too masculine to have competition in the church. It needs to be more nurture and
You get the idea.
well, I was saying earlier, if you have a Latin Mass at the same time at a relatively reasonable distance that your Novus Ordo parish is away from you, all else equal, if people decide to go to a Latin Mass, they might want to go to a Latin Mass consistently, but right now a lot of the Latin Masses are kind of shoved to the side. They're at awkward times, maybe on a Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening,
Yeah.
and there's only one in the diocese, so you have to drive an hour to get there. So, I mean, they're basically keeping this Latin Mass kind of in the corner,
Yeah.
crumpled up, and
A sideshow.
occasionally they'll mention it, but hardly ever. They'll just say, "Oh, well, yeah, if you really want the Latin Mass, we have one, so that's
Yeah.
fine."
As Father Z points out, it's like racial segregation, where you have, okay, this is the white lunch counter, and then over there is the colored lunch counter, and it's like dirty and they have beat up menus. Or there's the white movie theater, which has the best movies, and then the colored theater, and it has all these old movies that nobody wants to see, and extends. So it's almost like the bishops have said, well, my Novus Ordo people get the best. They have the white mass, and then traditionalists are stuck with the colored mass, which is at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're in a church with no air conditioning, and it's in a bad part of town. There's no parking. You get the idea.
But the funny thing is, most of the Latin Mass churches are the ones that are actually the beautiful churches that have art that you can tell what the art is, as opposed to some skeleton on the wall or something. And actually, I think it was. I'll save that for later, another video. But there's definitely a church that looks sort of like Mordor's tower. Yeah, you could. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of different stories about that. But the one thing I wanted to ask, why do these Latin Mass orders? I mean, they're pretty big.
Yeah.
So like the FSSP Institute of Christ the King, I don't think they don't have any bishops, do they?
No.
And
no.
do you know why? I mean, it's not necessary, but do you know why that's not the case? Like, are they trying to kind of stifle them a little bit?
Yes and no. That was an interesting thing that happened in the early days of traditionalism. After Archbishop Lefebvre did the 88 consecrations, he was allegedly excommunicated, and Fraternity of St. Peter made a deal with Rome. And if you go back and look at all the materials at that time, part of that deal was the possibility, the distinct possibility that Fraternity of St. Peter would get a bishop. And then it was at some point in time decided they wouldn't get a bishop and they would just rely upon diocesan bishops to do ordinations for them, which hasn't been a problem.
No.
There's plenty of diocesan bishops and cardinals who are willing to help them. So in that respect, it's actually worked out well, that they now have a whole army of Novus Ordo, I guess you'd call them Novus Ordo bishops, who are willing to say the old Mass, to give ordinations and the old rites for them, And an SSPX has their 3 / maybe 4 if you count Bishop Williamson bishops, so they do have bishops at their disposal. SSPX does, but it's not like the priestly societies right now absolutely need one, because they're just using the ordinary Roman bishops to help them.
It would give them more flexibility. I mean,
It would, and it would give them a sense of an empowerment, which is, I think, why Rome doesn't want to give them a bishop. Because if you have a bishop, you have to treat him well. You can't boss him around and say, you are suspended, and I want you never to say the Latin Mass again, and maybe I want you to just be a chaplain at this hospital. Because a bishop's going to say, like, sorry, it doesn't work that way. You're violating canon law, and you can't suspend me. I'm appealing to the Pope. Or you have a threat also if you really treat him bad and try to injure him outside of the law, then he'll say, well, unfortunately, you're not treating me right. I'll have to take emergency measures and go like Archbishop Lefebvre and set up a society. Well, the society was set up inside the church, but it continued in an irregular canonical structure after he was excommunicated. So they don't want the mainstream, the Vatican people, they don't want a traditionalist bishops there who are going to put their throat on the line, put their necks on the line for the old rite, because they're too powerful.
So, Ryan, are there any traditionalist bishops in the mainstream Roman Rite?
Yes, I'm glad that you asked that, and before the show I had done some research on it. There is the Apostolic Administration of St. John Vianney in Campos, Brazil, and that whole diocese could be a show of its own. But let me summarize it and say that there was a diocesan bishop there, Bishop Antonio de Castro Mayer, who was their bishop through the Vatican II period. The new Mass came out, and he said, I'm not using this new Mass, it's terrible. So he had a good number of priests, his diocesan priests, who stuck with him. Rome sent in a new bishop to try to push him out of the way, but more or less he stuck around, and he kind of had like a parallel diocese with the Novus Ordo diocese. He was going to die, so some of the SSPX bishops and Bishop Antonio Castro Mayer, they consecrated a successor. I think that was Bishop Wrangel, and Bishop Wrangel ruled that diocese, or that quasi-diocese, for a number of years. Then he got sick and he was going to die, and he said, I want another bishop, I want to do this on the up and up. So he contacted Rome, and they made a deal, and they says, okay, we'll regularize your little quasi-diocese here, and we'll give you a bishop. So in the deal with Rome, they consecrated Bishop Wrangel. Bishop Wrangel was co-consecrated by, Bishop Refon is the present bishop. He was consecrated. This happened 2001, 2002. And he was assisted by Bishop Wrangel, and also co-consecrated by Cardinal Hoyos, who was head of the Ecclesia Dei. So he is the one bishop in the mainstream Catholic Church, Novus Ordo, who is consecrated specifically for an old rite community. He's the only bishop in the mainstream Catholic Church who is consecrating using the ancient rite of episcopal consecration. So if the Sedevacantists are right and say that the new rite of episcopal consecration is invalid, then that means that Bishop Refon is the only bishop in the Roman Catholic Church who actually is a bishop. Not the Pope, not any cardinals, nobody else, just Bishop Refon. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting, and we don't usually see, a lot of us don't see outside of our own United States perspective too much, and even like the Western Church in Europe too.
Yeah.
Brazil's a really interesting
Very interesting,
country,
yeah.
But that's definitely an interesting thing, and I know Ryan sent me that email a while ago, and I was looking through the the organization.
Yeah.
It's a Priestly Society of St. John Vianney.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you would ask. It's a separate rite that exists only in this one diocese. I think it has like 40 or 50 priests. The diocese is small. It's like the size of ours, but it has 40 or 50 priests who just do the old mass, the old rite, the old sacraments, and they have their own bishop. It's really interesting.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
Thanks, John.
Thank
Good
you
question.
Yep. Thank you for watching. And if you have any comments, please comment below. Have a great day.
Peace.